Let me tell you something that ain't just history. It's prophecy fulfilled in real time. You ever seen a moment so powerful, so transformational, that the world didn't realize it had changed until it was too late? That was the day they lost India for good. Not lost it like misplaced it. No, no. Lost it like how a man loses grip on a rising rocket. Lost it like how you lose your hold over something you took for granted. For centuries, the world saw India as just a place of colors, chaos, call centers, and curry. They never understood the core. They thought they had India figured out, boxed up, labeled, a mystery sure, but one they assumed was harmless. But one day, oh, one day, they realized the power they mocked, the people they underestimated, had woken up. And by the time they saw it, India was already out of reach. See, here's the thing. India ain't just a country. It's a consciousness, a mindset, a force that lies quiet like a sleeping lion, but when that lion wakes up, phew, the jungle shakes. You remember those years when India was all about outsourcing, cheap labor. IT hubs, a place people called when they forgot their passwords. Yeah, that's what they reduced a civilization of 5 zeros. 0 years to. But Indians knew something the world didn't. They were learning, they were building. They were watching. While the world was using India as a ladder, India was studying how ladders were built. And then, one quiet morning, the world woke up and saw India was no longer climbing anyone else's ladder. They were building elevators of their own. The West thought they had a grip, a mental hold. They thought the power dynamic was fixed. They fed off of colonial guilt with a little spice of global strategy. But the problem with underestimating a nation like India is this. You forget they've lived through empires. They've seen Mongols, Moguls, British, Portuguese, Persians, and survived them all. They've been betrayed by allies, looted by invaders, and ignored by the media. But they never broke. They just adapted. You don't break what's born to bend and bounce back. I'll tell you the moment they lost India, it wasn't a single news headline. It wasn't when some trade deal fell apart. It wasn't even when India said no to some global agreement or skipped some diplomatic dance. No, the moment they lost India was when India stopped apologizing. That was the shift, the spark, the awakening. When India stopped explaining itself, when it stopped seeking validation, when it looked in the mirror and said, "We don't need anyone to tell us who we are anymore," that was the day it changed. You see, people spend so much time trying to fit into other people's rooms that they forget they can build their own house. India built its own, brick by brick, bite by bite, mind by mind. The day India said, "We're not here to be liked, we're here to lead," that was the day the world's leash snapped. Now I've seen countries grow. I've seen economies rise, but this was different. This wasn't just GDP, this wasn't just military drills or rockets in the sky. This was mental liberation, the final freedom. They didn't just break colonial chains, they broke mental slavery. They stopped chasing the West. They started blazing their own trails. Suddenly, the world's GPS was off. The compass spun. The old maps stopped working. India wasn't where they left it. It wasn't begging for attention. It was commanding respect. Oh, you felt it when Indian tech startups stopped copying Silicon Valley and started creating the next Silicon universe. You saw it when Indian scientists launched rockets cheaper than Hollywood movies. You felt the ripple when Indian culture, its music, its movies, its mythology, started trending without needing the West to approve. But the real earthquake, it came from the Indian youth. That's the fire the world didn't expect. See, for decades, India's youth were told, leave if you want to succeed, go west, go abroad, get out, and many did, but the ones who stayed, they weren't staying out of fear, they were staying out of faith. Faith in the soil, faith in the sunrise, and those young minds. They didn't just want jobs, they wanted to create empires. Indeed, when they started dreaming not in dollars but in disruption, that's when the script flipped. And let me tell you something personal. I've met Indians who walk into boardrooms not trying to impress. They walk in owning the room. I've seen Indian women who are not just breaking glass ceilings, they're building new buildings with no ceilings at all. I've seen rural innovators who took mud and code and created machines that solved problems Silicon Valley hadn't even dreamed of. That's the India they didn't see coming. Because here's the truth. They lost India the moment India stopped needing permission. That moment when Indian minds said, we'll fund our own startups, we'll build our own satellites, we'll protect our own borders, we'll tell our own stories, they thought influence came from Twitter trends and UN speeches. But India knew influence comes from impact. They thought they could silence India by excluding it from the table. But India built its own table, and the world started asking for a seat. Now let me be real clear. This ain't a speech about hatred or revenge. India doesn't want to get back at anyone. That's not what this rise is about. This is about self-respect, about finally owning your own narrative, about saying we were always enough, we just forgot for a minute, and you know the beauty? India didn't rise by stepping on anyone. It rose by stepping into itself. You ever seen a kid who's been doubted all their life suddenly get that fire in their eyes? That's India. The fire is in the eyes now. And that's dangerous, not to the world, but to the old powers who liked India being dependent. The global balance of power was built on assumptions. Assumptions that India would always need help, that it would stay grateful for scraps, that it would never challenge the status quo. But assumptions age fast in the face of truth. And truth is this: India has arrived, not as a colony, not as a junior partner, not as a silent observer, but as a shaper of destiny. You know what's scary to those who once ruled? A nation that remembers who it is, and India remembered. It remembered its sages and scientists, its warriors and weavers, its kings and coders. It remembered that it was never just a land, it was a light. A light that had been dimmed but not destroyed, and now that light is spreading again, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Manipur to Mumbai, from classrooms to boardrooms, from ISRO launch pads to deep tech labs. From the chants of Sanskrit to the code of Python, India is back. And this time, it's not asking to be included. It's redefining what inclusion means. I'll tell you what shook the world. It wasn't just missiles. It wasn't just money. It was the mindset. The mindset that said, we will not be ashamed of who we are. We will not dilute our identity to fit your boxes. We will not shrink so you can feel tall. That confidence, that authenticity, that scared them more than any weapon ever could. You know why they lost India? Because India stopped playing their game. It started playing its own, and it's winning. And when a nation finds that kind of clarity, oh, that's when empires fall without a shot fired. They lost India the day India realized that its value was never in how others saw it, but in how it saw itself. They lost India the day it said, we don't need your aid, we need your acknowledgement. They lost India when it chose dignity over dependence, purpose over praise. And let me tell you something else, they ain't getting it back, because this India, it's not turning back, it's not slowing down, it's not negotiating with doubt anymore. This India is building bridges where walls once stood. It's coding solutions where problems once festered. It's dreaming not of escape, but of elevation. They lost India the day India stopped being quiet. And baby, let me tell you, when India starts speaking its truth, the world better lean in and listen. Because this isn't a storm you can contain, it's a sun that's rising. And you can't stop the sunrise, so here's to the India they lost. The India that refuses to be underestimated. The India that's rewriting the script. And the India that's finally, unapologetically, standing in its own power. They lost India for good, and that might just be the best thing that ever happened to India. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. India's greatest transformation wasn't economic or military, it was psychological liberation. This liberation was not forged in conferences or passed through bills in parliaments. It was not handed over diplomatically or brokered in backroom trade deals. It was born in the silence of collective realization, the quiet explosion in the minds of over 1 billion people who had finally had enough of being told who they were, what they should be, and what they were worth. For generations, India had carried the burden of its own greatness, reduced to ruins by centuries of conquest and colonization. It was a civilization that taught the world mathematics and meditation, now being lectured on governance and technology by nations still in their historical infancy. But the real transformation came when India looked within and said, "We are not the shadow of our invaders. We are the light they couldn't extinguish." What happened next wasn't a campaign, it wasn't a speech. It was a shift, a tectonic mental shift. This shift didn't come from anger, it came from awakening. People stopped measuring themselves by foreign benchmarks. They stopped aspiring to be copies of Western dreams. They began creating their own models of excellence, rooted in ancient wisdom, tempered by modern clarity. And from that psychological shift, everything else followed. A soldier no longer fought just to protect a border. He stood for a civilization. A scientist no longer innovated to compete, he created to elevate. A child no longer studied just to get a visa, they dreamed to build at home. This was the power of psychological freedom, the type that colonizers feared the most. Once India stopped believing it was behind, it started realizing it was uniquely ahead. Ahead in resilience, ahead in ideas, ahead in the ability to merge tradition with technology. And in that realization, India became something the world wasn't prepared for, unapologetic. When India stopped seeking permission, that's when it started to become dangerous. In the best way, dangerous to old narratives, dangerous to those who thrived on its past dependency, dangerous to systems that functioned only when India doubted itself. Because for the first time, India didn't flinch when it was tested, it didn't retreat when it was challenged, it didn't shrink when it was mocked. Instead, it stood firm, calm, and precise. This clarity of identity fueled its strategic policies. No more hesitation, no more reactionary defense. This was proactivity, backed by purpose. Military doctrines weren't just about defense, they were about deterrence with dignity. Diplomacy wasn't just about survival, it was about strategy with sovereignty. The world could no longer dictate terms. They had to negotiate with a nation that had found its center. And at the center of this new India wasn't just politics or power, it was pride. A pride that was not arrogant, but rooted. Rooted in the awareness that this civilization had endured what would have destroyed others. That it had been broken, looted, humiliated, but had never lost its soul. And now that soul had awakened with intellect, innovation, and intent. What the world saw as nationalism was actually self-respect rediscovered. What they called aggression was confidence long denied. What they mistook for stubbornness was simply a country refusing to be bullied. This psychological liberation changed the way India negotiated trade deals. It changed how it spoke at global forums. It redefined the posture of its foreign policy. India was no longer the country that bent under pressure or sought affirmation. It became the country that walked out of rooms where it wasn't respected, and when it walked out, others followed, because courage is contagious, and when one nation dares to rewrite its narrative, it gives others the license to do the same. That's what made India's psychological liberation so powerful. It wasn't just national, it was global in its ripple effects. The military evolved not just with weapons, but with will. Strategy became less about imitation and more about innovation. War games included philosophy. Battle doctrines respected tradition. Tactical decisions weren't just about control, but about character. When India responded to threats, it didn't respond with noise. It responded with silence and precision. And that silence scared more people than the noise ever could. That silence said, We don't need to shout to be strong. This liberation didn't need tanks on TV. It didn't need slogans or fireworks. It manifested in the small things. In the way a young girl in a village picked up a science textbook with the dream of launching satellites. In the way a startup founder refused to sell his company to a foreign bidder, choosing instead to scale it on home soil. In the way a farmer used a mobile app coded in a local dialect to predict the monsoon and triple his yield. This was revolution, not from the top down, but from the inside out. Even in global crises, India didn't wait for a lifeline. It became the lifeline, whether it was exporting vaccines or technology, peacekeepers or philosophies. India began to lead not from a place of power, but from a place of purpose. And that purpose came from knowing we are not a nation waiting to be discovered. We are a civilization that the world has forgotten how to understand. This psychological transformation redefined success. No longer did Indians see success as escape, leaving the country for better opportunity. Success became service, staying in the country to build opportunity. The brain drain reversed. The diaspora came home, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to be part of the story. A story no longer told by others. A story now written in Indian ink. Universities changed, syllabi changed, mindsets changed. Children no longer learned only about Western revolutions. They learned about the Vedas, Chanakya, and the resilience of their ancestors. They stopped being ashamed of their languages, their clothes, their food, their festivals. The West called it exotic. India called it identity. And once you wear your identity with pride, nobody can sell you an illusion. This was the true face of defense. Not just protecting borders, but protecting beliefs. Not just holding territory, but holding truth. Not just national security, but narrative security. India became immune to propaganda because it became anchored in purpose. And when a nation is anchored, it becomes unshakable. That's what they feared, not the size of India's army or the growth of its GDP. They feared the rise of its consciousness, because once a nation starts thinking for itself, it can't be manipulated. Once it trusts itself, it can't be deceived. Once it respects itself, it can't be colonized again, mentally, economically, or culturally. That was the real independence, not August 15, 1947, but the moment the Indian mind refused to be dependent. This kind of liberation doesn't come with parades. It comes with posture. You see it in the eyes of a soldier who knows he's not just protecting land. He's protecting legacy. You see it in the engineer who's not just building bridges, but bridging centuries of stolen confidence. You see it in the entrepreneur who knows the best ideas don't need to be imported. They just need to be believed in. India's enemies weren't just borders and bombs. Its enemies were doubt, dependency, inferiority. And when those were defeated, there was no going back. You can rebuild cities, you can restore economies, but once the soul stands tall, it never bows again. And now, the soul of India stands tall, quietly, unshakably. That's why they can't touch it anymore. That's why old systems tremble. Because the game is no longer about power, it's about purpose. And India has found hers. India doesn't need to be the next America, or the next China, or the next Europe. India is becoming the first India, not the imitation but the original, and in doing so, it's reminding the world of something forgotten, that civilization isn't built by dominating others, but by knowing who you are. By standing firm when others push, by smiling when others doubt, by walking alone if that's what it takes. This psychological liberation wasn't loud, it was disciplined, measured, consistent. It was in the way India handled humiliation with grace, the way it answered criticism with creation, the way it took every wound and turned it into wisdom. It wasn't born from hate, it was born from hurt, but that hurt didn't become bitterness, it became fuel. Now that fuel is driving everything, defense, development, diplomacy, but most of all, it's driving dignity, and that dignity cannot be downloaded, it cannot be bought, it cannot be borrowed, It must be remembered. And India remembered. It remembered who it was, and that memory is more powerful than any weapon ever built.